The white silk train dragged through the dust like a wounded ghost, staining crimson where the desert stones bit deep. Magnolia Rose Thornfield had been the belle of Copper Creek, a vision in ivory lace and seed pearls, waiting at the altar of St. Matthew's Chapel while 300 guests shifted in their pews like restless cattle. The organ wheezed its patient melody for 27 minutes before Reverend Pike finally cleared his throat and spoke the words that would haunt her forever. It appears the groom has reconsidered. Now, 6 hours later, she rode hard through the canyon country with her wedding veil streaming behind her like a battle flag. Her father's prize stallion, Thunder, pounded the earth beneath layers of silk and crinoline that had cost more than most folks saw in a year. The pearl buttons down her spine caught moonlight, each one a small promise that had been shattered before God and everyone she'd ever known. Magnolia's gloved hands gripped the reins until her knuckles went white as her dress. She'd loved James Blackwood since she was 16, loved his crooked smile and the way he'd tip his hat just so when he saw her on Sunday mornings. They'd courted proper for 2 years, walking the long way around town so folks could see them together, planning their future on the porch swing while her mother served sweet tea and tried not to eavesdrop. The wedding dress had been her grandmother's, altered and adorned with fresh lace from San Francisco. Magnolia had sewn each bead by candlelight, dreaming of the moment James would lift her veil and whisper those sacred words. Instead, she'd stood there like a fool while whispers rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. He's run off with that saloon girl. Always knew he had a wandering eye. Poor Magnolia. What'll she do now? What she'd do was hunt him down like the yellow-bellied snake he was. The Thunder's hooves found rhythm on the rocky trail, and Magnolia let the motion carry away her tears. She'd cried enough for one lifetime back there in that chapel, watching her friends and neighbors transform from wedding guests to gossips in the span of a heartbeat. Her father had wanted to organize a posse, but she'd stopped him with a look that could freeze July. "This is my shame to bear," she'd told him, voice steady as stone, "and my justice to claim." The night air cut through her silk sleeves, raising goosebumps along her arms, but she pressed on. James had a 6-hour head start, but she knew these canyons better than most men knew their own backyards. Her daddy had raised her to ride and shoot alongside her 3 brothers, and while they'd all run off to seek their fortunes in California gold country, she'd stayed to tend the ranch and dream of a different kind of life. Those dreams lay trampled, now like her wedding bouquet, but something harder had taken their place. The trail wound deeper into the Badlands, where outlaws and desperados made their camps among the red rocks and hidden springs. It was no place for a lady, especially one dressed for a church social. But Magnolia had shed her ladylike ways somewhere between "I do" and "I don't reckon he's coming." You can almost taste the alkali dust on your tongue, feel how it settles between your teeth and coats your throat. The desert doesn't care about broken hearts or ruined reputations. It only cares about survival, and that suited Magnolia just fine. A coyote howled somewhere in the darkness, answered by another, then another, until their voices wove together like a funeral dirge. Thunder's ears pricked forward, but he didn't falter. He'd been bred for this country, raised on stories of Indian raids and cattle drives, and he could sense his rider's determination like a physical thing. They crested a rise, and Magnolia reined in to study the valley below. Campfire smoke drifted up from a cluster of adobe buildings. Perdition, they called it, though it had never appeared on any proper map. The kind of place where questions weren't asked and names weren't given, where a man could disappear if he had reason enough. And James Blackwood had plenty of reason to. She'd heard the stories, of course, whispered tales of card games and debts, of men who crossed the wrong people and found themselves running for their lives. But she'd chosen to believe in the James who brought her wildflowers and talked about building a house on the hill overlooking her father's spread. The James who'd kissed her so tender on her 18th birthday that she'd thought her heart might burst from pure joy. That James was as dead as her wedding dreams. The new James, the one who'd left her standing at the altar like yesterday's newspaper. That James was somewhere down in that den of thieves and cutthroats, probably drinking away his guilt and counting whatever money had bought his cowardice. Magnolia touched the small derringer hidden in her bodice, its weight reassuring against her ribs. Her brother Samuel had given it to her on her 16th birthday, along with lessons on how to use it. A woman alone needs to be her own protection, he'd said, and she'd rolled her eyes at his melodrama. She wasn't rolling her eyes now. Thunder shifted beneath her, eager to continue, but she held him steady. Below, shadows moved between the buildings, and she could hear the faint sound of piano music drifting up on the night breeze. Somewhere in that maze of sin and secrets, her runaway groom was likely spinning tales to anyone who'd listen, painting himself as the victim and her as some kind of she-devil he'd been lucky to escape. The thought made her jaw clench hard enough to crack teeth. But as she prepared to ride down into perdition itself, a rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, and someone screamed her name. The scream cut through the night air like a blade through silk, and Magnolia's blood turned to ice. Water in her veins. She knew that voice, had heard it call her name in laughter and whispered endearments for 2 long years. James. Thunder danced sideways as another gunshot cracked the silence, followed by shouts and the thunder of hoofbeats. Down in perdition, lanterns blazed to life in windows, and men poured from the saloon like ants from a disturbed hill. Magnolia pressed herself low against Thunder's neck, heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the chaos unfold below. As a rider burst from the settlement, bent low over his horse's neck, and even in the moonlight, she could see the familiar set of his shoulders. James Blackwood, running again, but this time with lead flying after him instead of rice and rose petals. Coward, she whispered, but the word tasted bitter on her tongue. Whatever James had done to earn that kind of send-off, it went deeper than jilting a bride. The pursuing riders, 4 of them, spread out like wolves hunting a wounded deer. Their horses were fresh while James's mount already showed signs of hard travel, foam flecking its neck as it strained up the canyon trail. They'd have him within the mile, and from the sound of their war whoops, they weren't planning to take him alive. Magnolia found herself at a crossroads more treacherous than any desert canyon. Every rational thought screamed at her to let justice take its course, to sit back and watch the man who'd shattered her life get what he deserved. But beneath the layers of hurt and humiliation, something else stirred. Something that remembered the boy who'd carved their initials in the old oak tree, who'd held her when her mother died, who'd promised to love her until the stars fell from the sky. Thunder felt her indecision and stamped restlessly, the bit jangling in the night air. The sound seemed to snap something loose in her chest, and before she could think better of it, she was urging him down the rocky slope toward the pursuit. Magnolia rose. "You've gone and lost your mind," she muttered, but her hands were already checking the Derringer's load. 2 shots. Against 4 armed men who probably hadn't seen the inside of a church since they were baptized, if then. The wedding dress transformed from hindrance to camouflage as she rode, the white silk blending with patches of alkali and moonlight. She stayed to the shadows, following deer trails her brothers had shown her years ago, cutting across the canyon's belly while the chase thundered along the main route above. You can almost feel the silk sliding against her skin, the way the corset stays dig into her ribs with each breath, the pearl buttons catching on mesquite thorns as she navigates the treacherous path. This wasn't how she'd imagined spending her wedding night. But then again, nothing about this day had gone according to plan. The riders were closing in on James when Magnolia emerged from a narrow draw 50 yards ahead of them. Her timing was perfect or perfectly foolish, depending on how you looked at it. She reined Thunder to a halt directly in their path. The wedding dress spread around her like spilled milk in the moonlight. The lead rider, a grizzled man with a beard that hung to his belt, nearly yanked his horse onto its haunches trying to stop. His companions bunched up behind him, cursing and fighting their mounts as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. "What in the Sam Hill?" the leader started, then his eyes went wide as saucers. "Boys, it's a haunt. A ghost bride." Magnolia let the silence stretch, watching them fidget in their saddles. Superstitious men, the kind who saw omens and spilled salt, and crossed themselves when owls called. She could work with that. "You seek the one who wronged me," she said, pitching her voice low and hollow. The canyon walls caught her words and threw them back, creating an echo that raised the hair on every man's neck. "But his debts are not yet due. Lady, you best move along," the second rider said, though his voice shook like autumn leaves. "This ain't no concern of yours." Everything that touches James Blackwood touches me, Magnolia replied, and that much was true as gospel. He carries my curse now, and I'll not have others claim what's mine to collect. The men exchanged glances, and she could see their resolve. Wavering. In the distance, James had managed to put another 100 yards between himself and danger, though his horse was clearly played out. Look here, specter or no specter, the leader growled, but his bluster rang hollow. That snake owes money to some very dangerous people. You can't just, can I? Magnolia let her voice drop to barely above a whisper, and the men leaned forward in their saddles to hear. Quick as striking lightning, she drew the derringer and put a bullet into the ground between the leader's horse's front hooves. The animal reared and plunged, dumping its rider hard onto the rocky ground. The next one finds flesh, she promised, and her tone carried more conviction than any preacher's sermon. The fallen man scrambled to his feet, face pale as chalk dust. You're loco, lady. Plumb loco. Perhaps, Magnolia agreed. But I'm also armed, and you're trespassing on my grief. Ride back to your employers and tell them the ghost bride claims this debt. Tell them she'll collect it in her own time and her own way. The three mounted men were already backing their horses away, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The leader grabbed his horse's reins and swung into the saddle with less grace than a sack of grain. This ain't over, he snarled, but he was already turning his mount toward perdition. It is for tonight, Magnolia replied, and fired her second shot into the air. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and the four riders scattered like quail. She sat there in the settling dust, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips, watching them disappear into the darkness. The wedding dress was torn now, stained with dirt and desert sage, but she felt more herself than she had in years. James had stopped his horse a quarter-mile up the trail, looking back with an expression she couldn't read at this distance. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the moonlit wasteland, the bride he'd abandoned and the groom who'd run. Then he touched his hat brim in a gesture that might have been gratitude or goodbye, and vanished into the shadows between the canyon walls. Magnolia holstered the empty derringer and gathered Thunder's reins. The night was far from over, and she had questions that needed answering. Whatever James had gotten himself mixed up in, it was bigger than a broken engagement and deeper than wounded pride. The piano music from perdition had stopped, and an unnatural quiet settled over the settlement. Even the coyotes had gone silent. As if the desert itself was holding its breath, she touched her heels to Thunder's flanks and started down the canyon, following the trail James had taken. The wedding dress whispered against the saddle leather, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, a sound that made her think of omens and endings. But as she rode deeper into the Badlands, a new sound reached her ears, the low, steady drum of many horses moving fast, and they were coming from the direction of town. The drumbeat of hooves grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like approaching thunder. Magnolia counted at least a dozen riders, maybe more, moving with the purposeful rhythm of men who knew their business and didn't plan on being denied twice in one night. She urged Thunder into the shelter of a narrow side canyon, pressing back against the rock wall as the sound grew closer. The wedding dress seemed to glow in the moonlight, a beacon that could betray her position to anyone who looked hard enough. She gathered the silk close around her, trying to make herself small, and held her breath. The riders passed in a cloud of dust and jingling spurs, hard men with harder faces, the kind who'd learned their trade in the border wars and perfected it in a dozen forgotten conflicts since. Their leader was a tall man in a black duster, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat that had seen better decades. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Spread out. Check every draw, every cave, every rabbit hole. The Blackwood boy's gone to ground somewhere in these rocks, and I aim to dig him out before dawn. What about that crazy woman in the wedding dress? One of the riders asked. The boys said she spooked him good. The leader's laugh was dry as desert bones. Ghost bride, they called her. Bunch of yellow-bellied fools. Ain't no such thing as ghosts, but there's plenty of folks who ought to be dead. We find her, we'll ask her some questions. Might be she knows more about Blackwood's business than she's letting on. Magnolia's blood chilled. These weren't the same rough-and-tumble bounty hunters she'd faced before. These men moved with military precision, and their leader spoke like someone who'd commanded troops in battle. Whatever James had stolen or gambled away, it was valuable enough to bring serious people into the game. The riders split up, some heading deeper into the canyon, while others doubled back toward the settlement. Magnolia waited until their hoofbeats faded before emerging from her hiding place. Mind racing with new possibilities. She'd known James since they were children, but how well did she really know him? The boy who'd caught fireflies with her on summer evenings was one thing. The man who'd left her at the altar was proving to be something else entirely. What had he been doing in perdition? What kind of debts could a small-town rancher's son possibly owe to men like these? Thunder picked his way carefully along the rocky trail, following the path James had taken. The canyon wound deeper into the Badlands, where the rock formations grew stranger and the silence more profound. This was Apache country, though the tribes had been driven south years ago. Now only the wind and the occasional prospector disturbed the ancient quiet. You can feel the weight of history in these stones, the whispers of peoples who'd called this place home long before the first white man ever saw the desert. There's something humbling about riding through such vastness, something that makes your troubles feel both insignificant and desperately important at the same time. About a mile deeper into the canyon, Magnolia found what she was looking for: fresh horse droppings, still warm, and the scuff marks where someone had dismounted in a hurry. She followed the trail on foot, leading Thunder through a maze of boulders until she reached a hidden spring surrounded by ancient cottonwoods. James sat with his back against a tree trunk, his wedding suit torn and dusty, his face haggard in the moonlight. His horse stood nearby, head down and blowing hard from the chase. When he saw her approaching, he didn't look surprised, just tired, bone-deep tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Magnolia," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer on his lips. "You shouldn't have come. Shouldn't have come." She stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see the cut on his cheek where a branch had caught him, far enough to stay clear if he tried to run again. "You left me standing at the altar like yesterday's trash, and you think I shouldn't have come? I was trying to protect you." He struggled to his feet, wincing as he put weight on his left leg. "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into. Then explain it to me." Her voice was steady, but her hands shook with anger and something else. Fear, maybe, or the remnants of a love that refused to die easy. "Tell me why you broke my heart in front of God and everybody. Tell me why those men are hunting you like a rabid dog." James looked away, studying the play of moonlight on water. "Some things are better left buried. Not this thing." Magnolia stepped closer, the wedding dress rustling around her feet. "Not after what you put me through. I deserve the truth, James Blackwood. All of it." The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves. When James finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You remember my Uncle Ezra? The one who went to California to strike it rich?" Magnolia nodded. Ezra Blackwood had been the family's black sheep, a gambler and a dreamer who'd headed west with nothing but hope and a worn-out horse. "He struck it rich, all right. Found a vein of silver that would have made him the richest man in 3 territories." James's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "But Uncle Ezra never was good with money. He got in deep with some very dangerous people, borrowed against his claim to cover his gambling debts. When he died, fever, they said, though I got my doubts, those debts became mine." "Your uncle's debts died with him," Magnolia protested. "That's not how the law works." "Ain't talking about the law, darling. I'm talking about men who make their own rules and enforce them with gun and rope." James touched the cut on his cheek, his eyes distant. "They gave me a choice. Marry you and use your daddy's ranch as collateral, or watch everyone I care about suffer for Uncle Ezra's mistakes." The words hit her like a physical blow. "You were going to use my family's land to pay your uncle's gambling debts. I was going to marry you and figure out another way." His eyes met hers, and she saw the truth there, the love and the desperation, and the terrible choice he'd thought he was making. "But standing there in that chapel, looking at you in your grandmother's dress, I couldn't do it. I couldn't trap you in this mess, couldn't make you pay for sins that weren't yours to bear. So you ran." The words came out flat, emotionless. "You left me to face the shame alone. I thought if I disappeared, they'd forget about the ranch. Go after me instead of you and your family." James took a step toward her, and she backed away. I was trying to save you, Magnolia. I was trying to do right by you for once in my worthless life. By breaking my heart. Tears she'd thought were all cried out stung her eyes. By making me look like a fool in front of the whole town. By keeping you alive. His voice cracked on the words. These aren't men you can reason with or buy off. They're killers, Magnolia. Stone-cold killers who'd think nothing of burning down your daddy's ranch with everyone inside just to send a message. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the night air, growing louder by the second. James's horse lifted its head, ears pricked forward, and thunder shifted restlessly beneath the trees. They found us, James whispered, and his hand moved to the gun at his hip. Magnolia, you need to get out of here. Now. But as the riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, Magnolia realized something that made her blood run cold. The man in the black duster wasn't looking at James. He was looking at her, and his smile was the most terrifying thing she'd ever seen. Well, the leader called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Looks like we found ourselves a 2-for-1 special. The man in the black duster dismounted with fluid grace, his spurs chiming against the rocks like funeral bells. Up close, Magnolia could see the network of scars that crisscrossed his face, souvenirs from a life lived on the wrong side of civilized society. His eyes were the color of winter ice, and they held about as much warmth. Miss Thornfield, he said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. Though I suppose it's still Miss, isn't it? Heard you had yourself quite the wedding day. You know who I am. It wasn't a question. Magnolia kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Know your daddy, too. Fine man, Thomas Thornfield. Built himself quite the spread out there. Good water, better grazing, and enough land to make a man rich if he worked it right. The stranger's smile never wavered, but something cold moved behind his eyes. Be a real shame if something happened to it. James stepped forward, his hand hovering near his gun. Leave her out of this, Carvale. Your business is with me. My business is with whoever can pay Ezra Blackwood's debts, the man called Carvale replied. And seeing as how you don't seem to have $20,000 in your saddlebags, I'm obliged to look elsewhere for satisfaction. $20,000. The number hit Magnolia like a physical blow. Her family's ranch was worth maybe half that, and only if you counted every head of cattle, every stick of timber, and every acre of good grassland. The girls got nothing to do with Uncle Ezra's gambling, James said, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew the truth. In this part of the country, debts followed family lines like blood feuds, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. Nothing to do with it. Carvale laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. Boy, you were fixing to marry her, make her part of your family. That makes her daddy's land part of the collateral, whether she likes it or not. The other riders had spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off any hope of escape. Magnolia counted 12 men, all armed to the teeth and looking like they'd done this kind of work before. Her empty derringer felt about as useful as a pebble against a mountain. There's another way, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Uncle Ezra's claim, the silver mine. That's worth more than any ranch. Carvale's expression didn't change, but she caught the flicker of interest in his eyes. What about it? James inherited more than just debts when his uncle died. He inherited the mine too. Magnolia looked at James, hoping he'd follow her lead. That's what you were really after, wasn't it? The silver. The mine played out years ago, James said quickly. Wasn't nothing left but empty holes and fool's hope. That's not what the assay reports say. Magnolia was gambling now, playing a hand with cards she couldn't see. But she'd heard her father and his friends talking about silver strikes in California. Knew that mines thought played out sometimes revealed new veins to those who knew where to look. Uncle Ezra had the mine surveyed just before he died. Found a new vein, bigger than the first one. It was a lie. She hoped it was a lie. But Carvale's eyes had gone sharp as a hawk's. What assay reports? The ones James has been hiding. She turned to face him, silently begging him to play along. The ones worth killing for. James stared at her for a long moment, understanding dawning in his eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of desperate hope. They're in my saddlebags, hidden in the lining. Show me, Carvale ordered, but his gun was already in his hand. James moved slowly to his horse, every gesture careful and deliberate. Magnolia watched the gunman, looking for any sign of weakness, any opportunity that might present itself. The wedding dress was a liability now, its white silk making her a perfect target in the moonlight, but it was also the only advantage she had. These men might be killers, but they were also superstitious, and the sight of a ghost bride had already spooked them once tonight. You can smell the fierce sweat on the desert air, mixed with gun oil and leather and the metallic taste of violence. About to unfold, the spring bubbled quietly in the background, indifferent to the human drama playing out on its banks. A reminder that the desert had seen men live and die for 10,000 years and would see 10,000 more. James reached into his saddlebags, his movements slow and deliberate. But instead of papers, his hand came out with a Colt .45, the barrel gleaming in the moonlight. "Nobody has to die tonight," he said, but his voice shook with the knowledge that death was already circling like vultures. That Carval's laugh was soft as silk and twice as dangerous. "Boy, you're outnumbered 12 to 1. You might get me, might even get one or two of my boys, but the rest will cut you down like wheat before you can blink." "Maybe so," James agreed, "but I'll make sure you're the first to go." The standoff stretched like a held breath, 12 men with their hands on their guns, waiting for someone to make the first move. Magnolia felt the weight of the moment, the terrible mathematics of violence that would leave most of them dead in the dust. That's when the Apache war cry split the night. The sound came from the canyon walls above, echoing off the rocks like the voice of the desert itself. It was followed by another, then another, until the air filled with the wild ululation of warriors on the hunt. "Apaches," one of Carval's men shouted, his voice cracking with terror. "We're surrounded." The gunmen spun toward the canyon walls, their weapons tracking shadows and moonlight. But Magnolia knew better. She'd heard that same war cry from her brother Samuel when they played cowboys and Indians as children. The Apaches had been driven south years ago, and besides, the sound was coming from only one throat, not a war party. In the confusion, James moved. His first shot took Carval in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying into the darkness. His second shot scattered the horses, and suddenly the canyon was full of plunging, screaming animals and cursing men trying to control them. Magnolia didn't hesitate. She grabbed Thunder's reins and swung into the saddle, the wedding dress billowing around her like a cloud. "James, come on." But James was already moving, vaulting onto his horse with desperate grace. A bullet whined past Magnolia's ear, and she bent low over Thunder's neck as they plunged into the maze of boulders beyond the spring. Behind them, Carval was shouting orders, his voice thick with pain and rage. "Find them. I want them alive. You hear me? Alive." The fake Apache war cries continued to echo from the canyon walls, and Magnolia found herself smiling despite the danger. Someone was helping them, someone who knew these canyons well enough to use their acoustics like a weapon. James's horse was laboring, foam flecking its neck as they climbed toward the canyon rim. The animal had been pushed too hard for too long, and it was starting to show. They needed fresh mounts, and they needed them soon. "This way," Magnolia called, leading them toward a narrow trail that switchbacked up the canyon wall. It was treacherous in daylight and suicidal at night, but it was their only chance. The rocks scraped against her legs as Thunder found his footing on the narrow path. Below them, torches flared to life as Carval's men organized their pursuit. The wedding dress caught on a mesquite bush and tore with a sound like ripping silk, but she didn't slow down. Halfway up the trail, James's horse stumbled and nearly went down. The animal was played out, running on heart alone, and they both knew it wouldn't make it to the top. "Leave me," James called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "Take my horse and go." "Like hell," Magnolia shot back. "You already left me once today. I'm not giving you the chance to do it again." She reined Thunder to a halt and slid from the saddle, the torn wedding dress hampering her movements. "Get on behind me. We'll ride double." "Magnolia, the horse can't carry both of us up this trail. Thunder's carried me and my daddy's prize bull up worse than this." She grabbed James's arm, pulling him toward her mount. "Trust me." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then a rifle shot spanged off the rocks above their heads, and the decision was made. James swung up behind her, his arms circling her waist as Thunder began the treacherous climb toward the canyon rim. The wedding dress spread across the horse's hindquarters like a banner, and Magnolia felt the symbolism of it, the bride and groom fleeing into the night, bound together by necessity if not by love. But as they crested the rim and looked back at the torches below, a new sound reached their ears, the rhythmic beating of drums, echoing across the desert like a heartbeat, and it was coming from the direction of her family's ranch. The drums beat like a countdown to doomsday, each strike carrying across the desert air with ominous purpose. Magnolia's blood turned to ice as she recognized the rhythm, not Apache war drums, but something far more sinister. Signal drums, the kind used by raiders to coordinate attacks across vast distances. "They're hitting the ranch," James breathed against her ear, his voice hollow with despair. "Carvale must have sent word before he came after us." Thunder stood trembling beneath them, flanks heaving from the climb, while below in the canyon torchlight flickered like fallen stars. The drums continued their relentless beat, and Magnolia could picture her father and the ranch hands scrambling to defend everything they'd built. "How many men does Carvale have?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "More than your daddy can handle alone." James's grip tightened around her waist. "This is my fault, Magnolia. All of it. Fault doesn't matter now." She gathered Thunder's reins, her mind racing through possibilities. What matters is stopping them. The ranch lay 15 miles northeast across open desert, hard riding even for a fresh horse. Thunder was strong, but he'd already carried them up an impossible trail, and asking him to make that distance with two riders would be pushing him to his limits. "There might be another way," James said slowly. "Uncle Ezra's mine. The real one, not the played-out claim everyone knows about. He found a new vein just before he died, just like you said. But it wasn't silver." Magnolia turned in the saddle to look at him. What was it? Gold. A fortune in gold, hidden in a cavern system that connects to the main mine. Enough to pay Carvale's debts 10 times over. James met her eyes, and she saw the truth there, the desperate hope and the terrible risk. But it's dangerous. The caverns are unstable, and Ezra died in there trying to extract the ore. Where? 2 miles north of here. There's a hidden entrance in Box Canyon, marked by a lightning-struck pine. James's voice dropped to a whisper. "Magnolia, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm choosing." She urged Thunder forward, following the canyon rim toward the north. "Those drums mean my family's in danger. If there's gold enough to buy their safety, then that's where we're going." The ride to Box Canyon took them across a moonlit wasteland of sagebrush and scattered rock formations. Behind them, the torches in the main canyon spread out like a searching web, while ahead the drums continued their ominous rhythm. Thunder found his second wind, sensing his rider's urgency, and carried them swiftly through the silver-washed landscape. You can feel the weight of the night pressing down like a physical thing, heavy with the scent of sage and the promise of violence. The wedding dress streams behind them like a battle flag, its torn silk catching starlight and transforming their flight into something almost mythical. The ghost bride and her reluctant groom, racing against time and fate. Box Canyon opened before them like a wound in the earth, its walls carved by flash floods and centuries of wind. The lightning-struck pine stood sentinel at its mouth, a twisted monument to nature's power. James guided her to a pile of boulders that looked like any other rock fall, but when they dismounted and moved closer, she could see the narrow opening hidden in the shadows. "The caverns run for miles," James explained as they squeezed through. "The entrance." Ezra left lanterns and rope, everything we need. "But Magnolia, if something goes wrong, nothing's going wrong." She struck a match and lit one of the coal oil lanterns hanging just inside the entrance. Golden light pushed back the darkness, revealing a natural corridor that stretched into the heart of the mountain. "We get the gold, we save my family, and we end this tonight." The cavern system was a wonderland of stone formations, flowstone cascades frozen in time, columns that stretched from floor to ceiling like the ribs of some primordial beast. Their footsteps echoed in the vast spaces, and the air carried the metallic taste of minerals and deep earth. They followed Uncle Ezra's rope guides deeper into the mountain, past underground pools that reflected their lantern light like mirrors. through chambers so vast their light couldn't reach the ceiling. And everywhere, scratched into the stone walls, were Ezra's notes and measurements. The obsessive record-keeping of a man who'd found his fortune and died trying to claim it. "Here," James said, stopping before a narrow passage marked with fresh chisel marks. The gold chamber. The passage opened into a circular room where the walls gleamed with veins of pure gold, thick as a man's arm and running in all directions. It was more wealth than Magnolia had ever imagined, enough to buy and sell entire towns. But Uncle Ezra's skeleton lay crumpled in the center of the chamber, his bones scattered by whatever final catastrophe had claimed him. "Cave in," James said quietly. "Look at the ceiling." Above them, cracks spiderwebbed through the stone, held in place by luck and prayer. The slightest disturbance could bring it all down, burying them alongside Ezra's bones. "We don't need to mine it," Magnolia said, studying the largest vein. "We just need enough to convince Carvale we can pay what's owed." Working together, they chipped away fist-sized chunks of gold-heavy ore, filling James's saddlebags with enough wealth to ransom kings. Every strike of the chisel made the ceiling groan ominously, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that miles away, drums still beat their deadly rhythm. When they finally emerged from the caverns, dawn was painting the eastern sky rose and gold. The drums had fallen silent, which could mean victory or defeat. There was no way to know without riding to the ranch. Thunder was waiting where they'd left him, grazing on desert grass and looking none the worse for his adventure. As they loaded the gold-heavy saddlebags and prepared to ride, a single rider appeared on the horizon. Coming fast from the direction of the ranch that it was Samuel, Magnolia's eldest brother, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat. He reined in hard when he saw them, his eyes taking in the torn wedding dress, the gold dust on their clothes, and the man riding behind his sister. "Magnolia, thank God you're alive." Samuel's voice cracked with relief. "Carvale's men hit the ranch 2 hours ago. Daddy's hurt bad, but he's alive. They're holding everyone hostage, waiting for you to come back." "How many men?" James asked. 8, maybe 10. They've got the house surrounded and everyone inside." Samuel's eyes hardened. As he looked at James, "This is your doing, Blackwood. Your debts, your trouble. And my solution," James replied, patting the gold-heavy saddlebags. Uncle Ezra's mind wasn't played out after all. "There's enough here to pay what's owed and more." Samuel's expression shifted from anger to amazement. "You found it?" "The lost mine. Found it and claimed it," Magnolia said firmly. "Now let's go in this." The ride back to the Thornfield Ranch felt like a journey through a dream. The torn wedding dress fluttered behind them like a banner of defiance, and the morning sun transformed the desert into a carpet of gold and shadow. When the ranch buildings came into view, they could see armed men positioned around the house, rifles glinting in the early light. They rode in slowly, hands visible, the gold-heavy saddlebags announcing their wealth to anyone with eyes to see. Carvale emerged from the house, his shoulder bandaged but his gun steady in his hand. "Miss Thornfield," he called out. "Right on time. I was beginning to think you didn't care about your family. I care enough to pay what's owed." Magnolia dismounted, the wedding dress pooling around her feet like spilled cream. Uncle Ezra's debts in full. She opened the saddlebags and let the gold or spill onto the ground, chunks of stone that gleamed with veins of pure metal. The sight stopped every man in his tracks, more wealth than most of them had ever seen. "There's your 20,000, James said, sliding down from Thunder's back. "And enough left over to compensate you for your trouble." Carvale stared at the gold for a long moment, then began to laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. The boy actually found it." He holstered his gun and gestured to his men. "Pack it up, boys. We're done here." As the gunmen gathered the gold and prepared to leave, Carvale tipped his hat to Magnolia. "My apologies for the inconvenience. Mississippi business is business. But I got nothing against your family. See that you remember that," she replied, steel in her voice. After they were gone, the Thornfield family emerged from the house, her father leaning heavily on her youngest brother's arm, but alive and whole. The ranch hands came out of hiding, and slowly, life returned to normal as the sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of hope and possibility. Magnolia stood in the yard in her torn wedding dress, watching James prepare to leave. "Where will you go?" she asked. "California, maybe. Or Oregon. Somewhere far enough away that my troubles can't follow." He paused with one foot in the stirrup. "Magnolia, about today, about everything. You came back," she said simply. "When it mattered most, you came back." He nodded, understanding passing between them like sunlight through clouds. Some love stories end with wedding bells, and others end with new beginnings. This was one of the latter. James mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, disappearing into the desert heat haze like a fever dream. Magnolia watched him go, then turned toward the house where her family waited. The wedding dress would never be white again, stained as it was with dust and adventure and the price of keeping those you love safe. But as she walked toward her future, uncertain now, but entirely her own, the morning sun caught the remaining seed pearls and made them shine like stars. Well now, that's a tale worth telling around any campfire. If you enjoyed riding along on Magnolia's wild adventure, be sure to let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the untamed frontier.